Okay, good afternoon everyone. Time for another episode, and in this one we are doing water, or rather we are creating a water plane from voxel data. So the goal here is to be as close to Valheim as possible, but I am making one or two small improvements. So let's get straight in. What this is also going to show us is going to show us a little bit more about how voxel worlds work and how voxel stacks and layers work. So the first thing I've done is I've moved my current existing voxel stuff into a folder called voxel terrain, and I have a new folder called voxel water. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new voxel world, and to that voxel world we are going to remove the stack first. Set it to the world origin as well. That's a good important step for later on. And then we're going to create a mega material for this world. Voxel mega material, and I'm going to dump it in my materials folder next to my other mega material, voxel water mega mat. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a layer stack for this. Now I've created a folder here called voxel stacks and layers, and we're just going to create a new voxel layer stack. Voxel water stack is what I'm going to call it. I'm going to open this stack and I'm going to remove the default layers that are put in there by the plugin. This is useful for getting started, but when you're doing more complex work like this, it can be tricky if you were just creating it immediately assigned to the world, because it'll start rendering stuff and confusing you. So we'll just remove them and close this for now. Then we're going to create two voxel layers. We're going to create one called voxel water height layer, and we're going to create another one called voxel water height spline layer. So the reason why I'm doing this is that I think splines are going to be a better way to do rivers. It's possible to do sort of riverish shapes with noise directly, but if we use splines, we will get a bit of control in PCG about how to place them and spawn them, and we will get a bit more control over the terrain noise of the spline. So yeah, we're going to add these both to the stack that we've just created. But what's important to notice is the order in which we're putting them in. Stacks, all of the data in voxel worlds flows down the stack. So the water height layer is now the bottom layer, the base layer that gets computed first, and then spline layer can have access to that data and create its own. Then from there it might go into further height layers or into the volume layers. We will be using more layers later on. So things like sculpting, it's best to do sculpting on their own sort of intermediate layer, both height sculpting and volume sculpting. So we'll see that later on, but this is it for now. And we can just add that water stack to our world. Now it's not got any data writing to the water stack, so we don't see anything yet. And I'm also going to move this into the voxel water folder and rename it to voxel water. Additionally, the voxel mesher can't do translucent materials at the moment as a nanite material, so we're going to disable nanite, and that is going to tell us it's going to need to create a material for non-nanite, and we can just click generate there. That's fine. Right. Yeah. So we're now ready to create a height graph for the plane, for the water plane. So I'm just going to open the voxel graphs, and we're going to create a new voxel graph, a height graph. I'm going to name this voxel water plane. Okay, I'm going to open that graph up first, and what we want to do in this graph is we're going to want to set the bounds. So we're going to make a box, and we're going to update the radius to a parameter, and the size of our world currently is 1 million units. So that's the radius we want on that. I also want to override the layer. So when you drag it into the world, it'll take a default layer, and usually that is the default layer. But we're using that for the terrain, so let's not use that. Let's override it with our water height layer. So it's always going to use our water height layer, and we're also going to override the blend mode to always be override. And with that, we just need to sort out the material. So I am using an Easy Systems water material as I said I would be in one of my previous videos. So I've just copied the entire materials and textures folder from Easy Systems. And then what I'm going to look for is I'm going to look for material instance ocean, and I'm going to create a voxel surface from that, and then I'm going to drag the voxel surface into my materials folder. More specifically, I want to put it into my surface type assets because that's what it is. And additionally, I should have also dragged it here, but let's go with that. Okay, so now we have a plane of height 0, same size as our world as well, and it's got a water material on it. Now, this is where previous recordings have fallen on their face, so let's see if we can do this relatively smoothly. Drag a plane into the world, great. Add the water material, great. And set it to world 0, great. Now, it does look a bit pants at the moment. I've just moved on to 5.6, and I'm pretty sure the issue here is that the voxel plugin is not doing world position offset right. So I'm just going to unpin that from the master material water. And okay, it's not got world position anymore, but it's a plane of water at world 0, and it goes under the entire terrain. If we zoom out, that's what our ocean looks like now. That's what our map looks like now. Now you'll see a bit of the ocean blue coming through if this isn't high quality, but we know we can improve the quality distance by doing this. Some water artifacts there on the material, but we have water on the world now. But the next step I want to do is I want to cut the water out so it's only creating a coastline so that we don't get water underneath our mountains. Now we can do this in the material graph quite easily. So we are going to query the terrain data by using this query height node. This query height node lets you query data on other stacks. So in this case, our terrain is being written to from the default height layer of our default stack. If I wanted to query my previous water height layers, which we will do later for splines, I would be using the sample height stamp node. That's how I would sample previous graphs that are also on this layer, but previous graphs that are also on lower height layers within this stack. But for now we're using this. So all we're going to do is we are going to select between, we're going to create a select node here, and where the water height is, so where the terrain is greater than or equal to our water height, which is actually 0, although I can promote it to a parameter, just so that we can move the water height if needed. What we want it to do is make a, what they call make a nan, I have no idea. Use this to disable stamps output. And that's just going to make the mesh, the voxel world sort of not be there. So we have this at the moment. You can see that the water line is following the terrain, and there's no water under the terrain now. There's no voxel water mesh. But it's not great, it's not perfect. And what we need to do here is we just need to lower this position by a little bit. I think I've gone for 200 in the past. Plug that in there. And then we see it conforms to the terrain much better. We can do more actually. Closer but not perfect. Let's just make it bigger. Great. So now it's creating underneath the terrain a lot more. Once we have world position offset, we will get a sort of bumpier shore. And we can also add surface foam as well. Well, sorry, shoreline foam as well. But we have our water plane, and we also have it so that underneath the land we don't have any water. currently, if we were to get our player digging and just dig down, water literally just would appear there, so it matches Valheim's behavior. But we can also use voxel graphs to override the ability for that water plane to appear there, and so we'll look at that in the future. And also the lodding can make the terrain not look as good, so we can also look into whether that needs to be resolved. Looks like a player's not really going to run into issues with that. It's only if you're looking at it from very high up that you can see the edges of the mesh appearing. So I'm not too worried about that. Okay, now we are going to create splines. First of all, we're going to update our terrain stack, because I also need to add a spline layer to our terrain stack. So I'm actually going to move away from the default stack, and I'm going to use a test stack that I had set up previously. And I'm just going to remove. I'm going to keep the default layer because our graph is right into the default layer, but I'm going to add a new layer for spline terrain. So voxel height layer, terrain, spline height layer is what I'm going to call that one. I'm going to chuck it in this voxel stacks and layers folder, and there we go. So we've got a spline layer after our height layer in our terrain stack. So we can now create a spline that is going to deform the terrain. Now, height splines are pretty complicated. Let's have a go at a height spline graph. Terrain height spline, I'm going to call this graph. Now when you drag it into the world, you will see that it comes with a stamp component and a spline component, and it comes with actually a very small spline. And what it's set to do currently, as it's an empty graph, is it's just going to be set to output height of 0 within the range and within the width of the spline, which is why we're getting this sort of boxy shape. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to override the spawning layer. I want it to affect the terrain spline layer, and I also want it to be set to override. Okay, so now it's not doing much of anything useful, but we can go ahead and make a change. Now because this is affecting the terrain, the height range is going to be roughly the maximum or minimum height of our terrain. So I'm going to change it to 30,000 on each of these for now. And as far as the material, what I want it to do is I want it to sample our previous layer. So I'm going to sample our voxel height stamp, it's going to sample our stuff, and it's going to get us the surface type back. Invalid stamp, sample height stamp. Oh, sample previous height stamps. That one's sampling a specific graph, which is not what I wanted. Sorry. Sample previous height stamps is what we want. And there we go. And if I was to plug the height in, what we would see is it looks identical. It's actually matching the exact terrain that it had previously, which is not what we're going to end up with, but I thought I'd show that. And you can see the material as well. It's showing the material at the ocean floor until it hits the swamp where it's showing the swamp material. But now let us build a spline. Okay, so we're going to start by using get spline point. He says. This is a special node. It'll default to doing something sensible, getting the nearest spline point based on the position of the voxel. But you can also override that to get a specific spline point if you need to. And then from there, we are just going to do a distance 2D node. We love our distance nodes in these graphs. Oops. convert it to vector 2D. Okay, vector 2D. Okay, so I want this to vector 2D just to convert it. Oh, should I? Is there a get spline point 2D? No, there isn't. Right, let's whack that in there. And then let's get the position of our voxels, because we are still working with our voxels. And I'm just going to whack this into the distance node. And true to form, we're going to use our next favorite tool with this kind of data, which is our height splitter node. Now, so what we're doing here is we are getting the distance from the spline and the current voxel. The voxel is going to be the spot on the terrain. We're in 2D, so it's the XY location of that voxel, and we're getting the distance from that to the actual spline. So what this can represent for us is our trench width. So if we're making a subtractive spline, we're taking away from the terrain, so we are creating a trench essentially. And then fall off is going to be our trench fall off. Now our distance is obviously going from 0 upwards as we get further and further away from the voxel, so we don't have to worry about anything below 0. And essentially anything between 0 and the end of, the separation line between the original buffer and, in this case, layer 0. Maybe this should be layer 1 really, but it is not. Anything inside of that is going to be our spline alpha. This is going to tell us, this is where we are wanting to affect our terrain. So I set our terrain width to a sensible value, something like, I'm going to go for 3000. 3000 is my terrain width, and my trench fall off is also going to be 8000. So now we've got a spline alpha that we can use to lerp between stuff that is outside where we want our spline to be affecting and stuff that is inside where our spline wants to be affecting. So we would actually use this previous height data, and we're going to lerp between that and our water plane, which is actually just height 0. And oh no, sorry, this isn't our water plane yet. This is our terrain. So what we actually want is another value called our trench depth. So we have a width for the trench on the XY, but we're not yet telling it how deep we want it to be. Why is that not working? Oh, it is. It's already there. Derp. And now with Valheim, the rivers are sort of 2D as well. It doesn't run downhill, it's not like a small trench that isn't, it just carves all the way through a mountain if it has to. So what that actually looks like for our intents and purposes is that we are going to take our trench depth away from the world height of 0. So it's always going to be a trench below the terrain height 0. Where we have our spline alpha. Where is my spline alpha node? Why am I having trouble with these? Get spline alpha. This might be a little bug with moving on to 5.6, which in case you haven't noticed, we've moved on to 5.6 with this. Okay, so we have our previous height, we have what our water trench is going to be below the world height, we have our spline alpha, and we can just more or less whack this into there. And then we're getting there actually, he says, but it doesn't look like it. We'll find out why in a minute. The last thing I need to do on this graph is set this max width. So this max width is showing what area the spline can affect in the world. Not just, it's a bit different to the spline alpha. The spline alpha is going to allow us to blend between the previous terrain, but also be within sort of the range of the stamp graph. The spline graph, but this max width is something else entirely, and for that we want to copy these and use these to determine, put a little buffer zone, how wide the bounds are on our spline. Okay. So we now have a spline here, but at the moment it's not deep. Is it because this is set to 0? Okay, I'll change my trench depth to 500. Oh, and all of a sudden, wherever this spline is, we no longer have any terrain. Great. So, but what it is not doing is when we go under a lot of terrain, we are not getting any water. That's because in our water water height graph, we are not worried about the spline data. Let's have a look. No, that's not it. Under my water graph, I should be keeping these in the water folder. Sorry, my terrain spline should be in the terrain folder, and my water plane should be in the water folder. That would be sensible. Yeah, in our water plane here, we are not doing anything sensible with the spline data. So if we move our terrain spline underneath the terrain, there's nothing telling the graph to spawn water there. But as you can see, it does keep the terrain at 0. Later on, we'll be able to make these banks a bit smoother and, well, not smoother, but probably noisier is the right action, because we don't want just a sheer straight drop. We want it to be noisy, and we'll be able to do that in the spline graph. But here we have something almost working. Now the final step here is to create another spline. This time a water spline rather than a terrain spline. So we are going to create another voxel graph, a height spline graph, and I'm going to call it water height spline. Now this is going to have to be placed manually for now, and it's going to look a little bit ugly, but eventually in the next video or so we'll be spawning these splines via PCG, and then it'll be easy because we'll just tell it to spawn one water graph and one terrain graph on the same spot essentially. So I'm going to place this water spline, and I am going to find the spline control points, and I'm just going to quite lazily for now replicate the spline that we've just created. Doesn't need to be exact because I'll give it a bit of a extra width. But yeah, I've got a water height spline, and I'm just going to hop into that graph. I'm going to override what it's doing. So I want it to output data to the water height spline layer node. I also want it set to blend mode override. So what you can see is, because the height is 0, it's already trying to create a plane at 0 with no surface type. So we can actually just use our voxel material ocean, and it's already started doing something. We're almost there, really. Let me see. What else did I want it to do? I think more or less from here, all we do is just create the width of it, or increase the width of it. So if I make this 10,000, you'll see the water plane immediately get wider. Yep. So now wherever this spline is, 10,000 units on either side of it is going to be a water plane, which is not too bad. This is going to depend on the total width. You know, as long as the terrain that is placed in the same location, the terrain spline, doesn't have a max width greater than our water height spline, you'll always end up with water filling the gap and overflowing it a little bit. We can tighten this up if we need to. We know that our width is around 5,000. So again, it will get messy if the splines aren't exactly the same, but we're going to be using PCG to spawn them, so they will be the same. And we can just continue grabbing both of these splines and dragging them out to showcase what it looks like. Okay, let me get the other spline. Okay, terrain spline. There we go. So there we go. Once it's refreshed, it's just going. Okay, so in the next video we will add some foam to the shoreline of the splines and the world, which is pretty straightforward for both. And we will start looking at PCG for spawning a lot of the stuff that we want on a Valheim map. So we're going to be looking at the origin, POI, point of interest. We might look at spawning some boss locations, and spawning rivers. Actually, I'll probably start with rivers just to make the world look a bit nicer, because I'm all about the map, really. We're not going to get too far in actual gameplay mechanics. This is all about making a pretty map. Okay, so thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, please let me know. And I'll see you in the comments section.